The roar cut through the Kenyan savanna like a lightning strike, deep, thunderous, alive, with something that felt less like sound and more like memory tearing open the air. Dozens of tourists inside the safari jeep jerked upright, their binoculars trembling in their hands. Even the seasoned guide, Elias Njoroge, who had spent 27 years navigating these plains, froze with his hand hovering over the gear shift. He had heard thousands of roars in his life, but this one was different. Older, sharper, charged with a strange urgency that made every hair on his arm stand on end. But the person who reacted most strongly was Margaret Hartley, 70 years old, silver-haired joints aching from a lifetime dedicated to wildlife rehabilitation. And yet she sat straighter than anyone else, her breath catching in her throat as if the roar had reached inside her chest and pulled something loose. She didn't know why. She couldn't explain it. But deep inside, something whispered to her, that voice. I know that voice. The jeep rolled to a halt in a cloud of red dust. Silence swallowed the savanna. Even the birds seemed to hold their wings still. The horizon shimmered under the late afternoon heat, the air trembling like something alive. Then from behind a cluster of acacia trees, on a low-rise movement, stirred slow at first, then unmistakably deliberate. A shape emerged, massive and golden, carrying the weight of a kingdom in every step. The lion. But this wasn't just any lion. Elias cursed softly under his breath, his voice barely above a whisper. It can't be. The lion stepped fully into view and gasps erupted inside the jeep. He was enormous, towering, even for an adult male, his mane thick and sunlit gold streaked with darker patches that made him look carved from fire. But what seized everyone's attention wasn't his size. It was the way he moved. Not like a hunter, not like a threat, but like a creature searching for something long lost. Margaret felt her pulse thundering in her ears. Her throat closed as recognition, impossible, ridiculous, unscientific recognition, stabbed through her. The head tilt, the slow sweeping scan of the horizon, the slight favoring of the right foreleg. No, she whispered, gripping the railing of the jeep. It can't be him. The tourists exchanged nervous looks. None of them understood why a retired wildlife specialist from Boston suddenly looked as though she'd seen a ghost. Only Elias saw the truth in her expression. He had guided enough scientists, rangers, and rehabilitators to know when someone wasn't just looking at an animal, but at a memory. Before anyone could process what they were witnessing, the lion lifted his head and roared again. This time it wasn't a warning. It wasn't territorial. It was a call, and it was aimed directly at their jeep. Elias reacted instantly. Hold on, he's coming straight for us. The engine sputtered awake just as the lion broke into a run. Within seconds, he was a golden blur slicing through the tall grass, the ground trembling beneath the weight of each leap. Screams erupted inside the jeep. A woman ducked behind her husband. A man fumbled for his camera before dropping it entirely. Someone sobbed a prayer. But Margaret didn't scream. She didn't hide. She didn't move at all. Her eyes stayed locked on the lion rushing toward them with terrifying speed and an expression that no field guide had ever documented. Not aggression, not hunger. Something far more unsettling: recognition. The heat shimmered around him. His mane whipped in the wind. Dust spiraled behind his pounding paws. And in that impossible instant, Margaret didn't see the king of the savannah charging toward her. She saw a trembling, blood-stained cub lying in her lap 12 years earlier, desperately searching for milk that only she could give. She saw the long nights of warming bottles over a gas stove in a makeshift Kenyan shelter, singing lullabies she barely remembered from childhood. She saw the promise she made whispered into a tiny tufted ear. I will love you until the day you no longer need me. The lion covered the distance in seconds, 50 meters, 40, 30, an unstoppable force of muscle memory and something that felt eerily like longing. Elias slammed the brakes. Dust exploded around them. Stay inside, he shouted. Everyone stay inside. But Margaret's hand was already on the door, and the moment she touched the handle, the lion skidded to a stop, just 5 meters away, breathing hard, staring at her as if she were the only living thing on earth. The savannah fell unnaturally silent. Margaret slowly stepped down from the jeep despite every horrified protest from Elias. Her heart hammered violently, but her voice, though trembling, felt like a truth emerging from the deepest part of her soul. Aslan. The name escaped her lips like a prayer. The lion's ears twitched. His massive body softened. His tail lowered from its alert posture. And then, before the stunned eyes of every person in that jeep, the king of the Golden Plains did something no wild lion should ever do. He took one careful step forward, then another, then lowered his gigantic head and let out a rumbling, broken sound no one on that vehicle had ever heard from a lion. A sound that didn't belong to a predator, a sound that belonged to a child finally finding home. Elias covered his mouth with a trembling hand. My God, he knows her. And that was how it began, with a roar that stopped the savanna, with a lion running towards certain danger, with an elderly woman stepping into that danger as if it were destiny. No one could have imagined what would happen next. No one was prepared for the reunion that would break every law of nature and prove that true love leaves a mark deeper than instinct, time, or the wild. Margaret never forgot the weight of that tiny trembling body the first time she lifted him from the dust. Back then, Aslan was little more than a heartbeat wrapped in golden fur, weak, dehydrated, and shaking from the cold, despite the burning Kenyan sun. His mother's final act had been to lay him at Margaret's feet, trusting a stranger with the most precious thing she had left. That moment carved itself into Margaret's soul so deeply that even years later she could still feel it, the softness of his fur, the warmth leaking from his little body, the desperate way he tried to nuzzle into her chest as if searching for the mother he had just lost. She didn't know it then, but that day marked the beginning of a promise that would shape the next 12 years of her life. The reserve authorities argued the paperwork seemed endless, and Margaret knew she was fighting an impossible system, but she could not let Aslan go. Not after what she had witnessed. She had spent her life working with endangered species, nursing injured jaguars in the Brazilian Pantanal, and bottle-feeding abandoned snow leopard cubs during her volunteer years in Nepal. But something about Aslan was different. Something in the way his fading eyes lingered on her. Something in the way his mother had searched Margaret's face before taking her final breath. This isn't a case, she told the authorities in Nairobi. This is a promise, and promises to Margaret were sacred. The nights were the hardest. They were filled with soft, heart-wrenching cries that echoed through the small rented cottage on the outskirts of Nairobi. She spent those nights sleeping on a thin mat beside him, her hand always close enough that he could reach it with his tiny paw. Whenever he whimpered, she whispered to him in Portuguese, the language of her childhood, the language of safety and lullabies. Calma, meu amor. I am here. And somehow he always understood. But caring for him wasn't just emotionally grueling, it was terrifying. Every feeding required exact measurements of milk replacer, vitamin supplements, and hydration fluids. Even one mistake could cost him his life. Many cubs rescued from the wild did not survive. They were too fragile, too traumatized, too dependent on the mother they'd lost. Aslan struggled too. Some nights he refused the bottle entirely, so weak that he barely lifted his head. Margaret would warm towels, press him gently against her chest, and rock him as she hummed old lullabies. During his second week with her, she found him barely breathing. She panicked for only a second, then instinct took over. She performed shallow chest compressions with 2 fingers, manually stimulating his lungs until with a choked gasp, he breathed again. She dropped to her knees, shaking tears dripping onto his fur. You're meant to live, she whispered fiercely. I know you are. Don't give up. And he didn't. By the time Aslan was 3 months old, he had transformed. His once sunken eyes glowed with curiosity. His steps became steadier. He followed Margaret everywhere, pawing at her shoelaces, tumbling over his own feet, stumbling after butterflies in the yard. He learned her routines. When she brewed tea, he curled beside her feet. When she wrote reports on her laptop, he crawled beneath the desk, using her ankles as pillows. Dr. Nasir, a local wildlife veterinarian, visited weekly and was stunned at his progress. He shouldn't have made it, he said during one checkup. Most lions in his condition rarely survive past the first few weeks. Margaret stroked Aslan's maneless head as he purred against her thigh. He had a mother who gave everything for him, she said softly, and I think he remembers that. But even in those warm, hope-filled days, a shadow lurked at the edge of Margaret's thoughts. He was growing rapidly. His instincts sharpened with each passing week. He pounced on shadows. He stalked birds in the yard. He hissed if startled. Margaret knew he was wild, not domesticated, and no matter how deeply he trusted her, she could never make him forget who he truly was. He belonged to the savannah, not to her living room. Still, she poured herself into raising him. She built makeshift enrichment activities from old ropes and wooden blocks, encouraging his muscles to grow. She taught him to climb small rock piles, to stalk playfully behind bushes, to react to sounds and scents. And every night, every single night, he curled against her legs, his body growing bigger and warmer until she could barely shift without nudging him awake. When he reached 6 months old, the first signs appeared, the change she had been dreading. His growls deepened. His paws grew massive. He began challenging shadows, reacting to noises outside with an alertness Margaret had never seen before. Once he growled at a passing hyena beyond the fence, positioning himself between the window and Margaret's bed in an instinctive act of protection. "You're becoming who you were meant to be," Margaret murmured, brushing her fingers along the outline of his jaw. "But it means you can't stay." She said it aloud because she needed to hear it. She needed to accept it. Aslan, however, simply leaned his forehead against her arm, and for a moment she felt a painful surge of love, so strong she had to look away. Releasing him would break her heart, but keeping him would break his spirit. The wildlife officials offered her a solution, a private rewilding reserve in the Tsavo region, known for its success in reintegrating orphaned predators. Aslan would be introduced gradually, first into a protected area, then into a larger reserve where he could interact with other lions. "Once he's ready, we'll release him fully," Officer Mudiso explained. "He will live as he should, free." Margaret nodded, even though tears burned behind her eyes. Freedom, the word felt both beautiful and cruel. On Aslan's last night with her, she took him into the yard where the night sky glowed with millions of stars. He rested his head on her lap, heavier now, powerful. She stroked his growing mane for hours, memorizing the feel of him, his warmth, his breathing, the shape of his paw pressed against her leg. "You're going home tomorrow," she whispered, "to the life your mother wanted for you. And I'll let you go, even if it breaks me." Aslan purred, a deep, resonant vibration that she felt in her bones. She closed her eyes and leaned her forehead against his. "This is not goodbye," she said. "This is the beginning of your story." But she was wrong. It was the beginning of their story. A story that would echo across the savannah for 12 long years, until a roar shattered the plains, and a lion who shouldn't have remembered anything remembered her. The years that followed Aslan's release unfolded like the slow turning of seasons, each one marking another chapter of a life Margaret could only imagine from afar. She returned to Brazil, then to conservation fields across Latin America, then briefly back to the UK, always carrying with her the shadow of a golden cub who had once slept beneath her desk. She didn't dare ask about him. She told herself it was better to let the wild be wild, better to assume he was thriving than risk hearing that he hadn't survived. But the truth was simpler. She couldn't bear the possibility that he had forgotten her, that the cub who once cried into her hands now roamed the savannah, with no memory of the woman who had fed him at 3 a.m., who had sung lullabies over his tiny body, who had promised a dying lioness that she would protect him. She wrapped her days in work and purpose, but on quiet nights she still heard echoes, soft purrs, tiny whimpers, the weight of a warm cub curled against her ribs. Those memories remained sharp, as if they had been burned into her bones. What she didn't know, what no one knew, was that across the world, in the wild expanse of Tsavo National Park, a lion was also carrying memories that shouldn't have survived. Aslan grew into legend. Researchers first noticed him around age 3. He was larger than most males his age, already carrying a mantle of gold, thicker and fuller than typical Tsavo lions. His mane dark and early, streaked with amber and bronze that glowed like embers at sunset. Guides called him the Golden King long before he earned the title, drawn to the quiet authority with which he carried himself. He walked with a confidence that made older males hesitate, and when he roared, the ground seemed to vibrate in response. But there was something else, a behavior no one could explain. He kept to a specific region of the reserve, circling a particular acacia grove every few days. Rangers noted how he sat facing the wind, as if waiting for a scent that never came. They watched him approach vehicles more calmly than any wild lion they'd observed, pausing with ears pricked, nostrils flaring subtly, as if searching for something familiar. It was not tameness, his instincts remained lethal, his power unmistakable, but it was a kind of searching, a habit, a longing. Some lions revisited old kill sites or sleeping grounds. None revisited abstract memories. No one connected these behaviors with a woman thousands of miles away kneeling in Brazilian soil to measure jaguar tracks, but a bond like theirs never fully dissolves. It may stretch, fade, or fall silent, but it waits for the right moment to spark back to life. Aslan became more than a dominant male. He redefined what dominance meant. Most males fought brutally for territory. Aslan challenged only when necessary. Guides recorded incidents where he protected wounded lionesses, allowing them to recover instead of abandoning them. Once he chased off a pack of hyenas, not to defend a carcass or a rival lioness, but to protect a young elephant calf that had been separated from its herd. Rangers found tracks proving he had circled the calf until help arrived. Lions weren't supposed to act that way. He has a memory, one researcher wrote in her field notes, a memory that shapes his choices. But memory was not a word many scientists used for lions, not long-term memory, not emotional memory. Yet Aslan behaved as though he carried an imprint, not just of the wild, but of something gentler, something older, something human. When he reached 8 years old, he was crowned the true king of the region. His pride flourished: 3 strong lionesses, 5 healthy cubs, and a territory expansive enough that other males submitted without a fight. Photographers from National Geographic attempted to capture him, but Aslan often eluded them, appearing only when he chose to vanishing into tall grass with the silent confidence of a ruler who belonged to the land itself. But sometimes, just sometimes, when a safari vehicle passed, he stepped closer. Close enough to startle tourists, close enough to make guides nervous. Yet he never attacked, never even growled. He simply observed muscles, relaxed breaths, steady golden eyes searching each row of faces as though looking for someone specific. Someone who wasn't there. Someone who had once whispered to him under starlight. Margaret. By the time he was 12, there was no disputing it. Aslan was the most extraordinary lion Tsavo had seen in decades. Older now, with a mane touched by the slightest hints of age-darkened copper, he walked with a calmness that unsettled every researcher who tried to classify him. He was powerful beyond question, but he seemed to battle only when necessary. He approached humans not with aggression, but with intention. He remembered things he was not supposed to remember. And then something changed just days before Margaret arrived in Kenya for the symposium. A scent, a breath of lavender and vanilla carried unexpectedly across the plains as a safari jeep passed his territory, a scent so small it should have dissolved instantly into the dry air. Yet it struck Aslan like lightning. He froze. His chest rose sharply. His head lifted. He inhaled with an urgency his pride had never seen. He turned toward the vehicle. Not toward the driver, not toward the tourists, but toward that smell. The scent of nights long past. The scent of comfort and safety and home. The scent of the only human he had ever trusted. His lionesses watched him stand taller, muscles tightening like coiled wire as he sniffed the wind again. Then he did something he had never done in his life. He ran. Not the calculated predatory run of a hunter, but the desperate, heart-driven sprint of someone who recognized something impossible. He flew across the savanna mane streaming behind him, like firepaws pounding the earth with a force that made birds scatter from trees. For the first time in 12 years, instinct and memory collided violently, unmistakably beautifully. He remembered, and he was going to her. Science couldn't explain it. Guides had no words for it. Even the lions in his pride seemed stunned by his sudden departure. But some bonds defy biology. Some connections are written not in the brain, but in the soul. And Aslan, the golden king of Tsavo, was running toward the woman who had saved his life, raised him from infancy, and let him go with tears on her cheeks and love in her hands. He remembered the promise she whispered to his dying mother. He remembered the warmth of her lap under a starlit sky. He remembered the scent of lavender and vanilla that meant safety, comfort, a world beyond hunger and danger. He remembered Margaret, and nothing, neither time nor distance nor the vast savanna, could keep him from her now. The moment Aslan stopped before her, just 5 meters of trembling earth, and held breath between them, every law of nature seemed to collapse into silence. Margaret had spent her entire life working with predators, documenting instincts older than civilization, watching jaguars, pumas, gorillas, and wolves follow the ancient script of survival. But now as she stood on unsteady knees in the middle of the Tsavo Plains, she realized something that made her heart ache with impossible wonder. Aslan was not following instinct. He was choosing something else entirely. His massive body quivered not with aggression, but with recognition so fierce, so overwhelming, that even the guides who had prepared themselves to fire tranquilizers stood frozen, unable to reconcile what they were seeing. Aslan's golden eyes stayed locked on her face, tracing every wrinkle, every line time had carved into her skin. He took a step forward, slow and deliberate, lowering his head as if afraid to frighten her. Margaret felt her breath tremble out of her chest. She whispered his name again, barely audible, but somehow it cut through the heavy air like a heartbeat carried by the wind. Aslan! It would have been natural, expected for a wild lion to react to the sound of a human voice with caution, confusion, even hostility. But Aslan's reaction was immediate and filled with emotion. His ears relaxed, his lips softened. A deep, rumbling sound rolled through his chest, not a growl, not a warning, but an unmistakable purr, a sound so powerful it seemed to ripple through the very ground beneath her feet. Lions were not supposed to purr like house cats. Not like this, not toward humans, not after 12 years of wilderness. Yet Aslan did. He remembered. Margaret's knees gave way and she sank gently to the ground, her palms pressed into the warm earth. Aslan stayed perfectly still, as if waiting for her to settle before he moved closer. When she was seated, he stepped forward and lowered his enormous head until it rested lightly on her lap. His mane brushed her arms, thick and warm, carrying the scent of grass, dust, sun, and the raw, wild world he ruled. She lifted her trembling hands and touched his cheeks, running her fingers through the golden strands that she had once stroked when he was small enough to sleep beside her desk. His breath came in slow, rhythmic huffs. He closed his eyes, giving himself over to her completely, a gesture of trust no one in the jeep behind her could comprehend. For a long moment, Margaret forgot the onlookers, forgot the cameras clicking softly, forgot her own fear or logic. All she saw was him, her lion, her orphaned cub, the baby she had bottle-fed at dawn, the creature she had raised with her own hands and let go with a broken heart. Aslan, she murmured again, her hand settling gently on the bridge of his nose. Look at you. You're so magnificent. You're everything your mother hoped you'd be. He nudged her gently, pressing his forehead into her sternum with astonishing tenderness. Margaret laughed through her tears, the sound cracked with age and emotion, and leaned her forehead against his mane. She could feel the strength beneath her cheek, the steady rhythm of a heartbeat that echoed through years of separation, loss, and survival. The guides said nothing they didn't dare. Even the lionesses watching from a distance remained quiet, sensing something sacred unfolding. For a moment, time stood still. When Aslan finally lifted his head, he didn't step away. Instead, he examined her with that deep, liquid gaze, golden, ancient, impossibly wise. In the late afternoon light, his eyes reflected her image back at her, and she realized something that made her chest ache. He was memorizing her. Just as he had memorized her scent, her voice, her hands, he was memorizing her face now, knowing instinctively that this moment was fleeting, precious, and final. Margaret steadied herself and lifted her hand. You're not the little cub who slept under my desk anymore, she whispered. You are a king now, a leader. You have a family here. You don't belong with me, not anymore. He blinked slowly, and she saw emotion there. Not human emotion, not something she could label, but something powerful and ancient, something that transcended every scientific explanation she had ever trusted. He understood. On some deep primal level, he understood. A distant roar carried through the plains the call of his pride. His lionesses were waiting. The cubs he had fathered were waiting. His world was calling him back. Aslan's ears flicked, his gaze shifting momentarily toward the sound before returning to her. Margaret placed both hands on his jaw, feeling his rough whiskers tickle her palms. Go, she said gently, even though her voice shook. They need you. They're your family now. And I'm just grateful I got to see you again. Aslan let out another low, vibrating rumble. Then he did something that struck Margaret to her core, something no biologist, no ranger, no observer would ever be able to explain. He bowed. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered his head until his forehead touched the earth at her feet, a gesture of respect so profound it stole the breath from everyone who witnessed it. A king acknowledging someone who had shaped his life in ways no wild creature should remember. Then he rose. He took 3 steps back before he turned away. But before his mane slipped into the tall grass, he looked over his shoulder one last time. Their eyes met. Margaret felt warmth flood her chest, a final message carried without words. Thank you for my life, for my freedom, for keeping your promise. Aslan let out a powerful roar that rolled across the plains like thunder before bounding off toward his pride with graceful strides, vanishing into the golden horizon. And Margaret, kneeling alone in the red dust of Tsavo, understood with absolute clarity he had not chosen instinct. He had chosen love. The jeep hummed quietly as it moved deeper into the reserve, the late afternoon heat rippling across the plains like a golden veil. Margaret sat in the back seat, fingers woven together so tightly her knuckles ached. Even after everything she had lived through, rehabilitating jaguars, tracking gorillas, tending to orphaned pumas, she had never felt a pressure like this. For 12 years, she had carried both longing and acceptance in her heart, believing she would never again see the lion she had raised, never again hear the rumble of his cub-like purr, never again touch the warmth of his growing mane. But life, the wild, and fate had conspired to bring her here. And now, after the impossible reunion on the hill, after Aslan had rested his massive head in her lap, like the baby she'd once soothed to sleep, the question remained, what did that moment truly mean? For him, for her, for the very relationship between humans and wild animals. Word of the encounter spread like wildfire through the reserve. Rangers whispered about the old woman who had walked toward a charging lion and lived. Biologists pored over the footage again and again, searching for logical explanations. Photographers who had frozen in terror now found their hands shaking for a different reason, because they knew they had witnessed something history would argue about for decades. But for Margaret, none of that noise mattered. Aslan had remembered her. The reality of it settled into her chest with a weight both comforting and devastating. She sat on the edge of her cot that night, the canvas tent flapping softly against the wind, and replayed every second in her mind, the recognition in his eyes, the gentle press of his forehead to hers, the way he had stayed so still, so calm, as if afraid that the slightest movement might shatter a moment he had waited years for. Most lions forgot their own siblings after long separations. Males often killed their own offspring without knowing they were theirs. Yet Aslan, her cub, who had suckled from a bottle held in her weathered hands, had broken every rule of instinct, biology, and logic. As the camp settled into silence, a soft knock came at her tent flap. James the guide peeked in. "Mrs. Thompson," he said quietly, "are you awake?" "I doubt I'll sleep tonight," she admitted with a gentle breath. "Tomorrow morning," he said, stepping inside, "we can take you back out to the hill if you want. The pride sometimes stays in that area until sunrise." Margaret hesitated. Would that be dangerous for him? James shook his head. "He knows his boundaries. And after today," his voice trailed off, still full of disbelief. "Honestly, I think he'll keep his distance. He seemed protective of you." Margaret looked down at her hands. They still smelled faintly of lion, earthy, warm wild. "Yes," she whispered. "He always was." She didn't sleep. Instead, she spent the night listening to the distant grumble of lions calling across the valley. Each roar echoed something inside her memory grief, years of longing that now felt strangely soothed. Dawn finally painted the horizon in shades of fire, and Margaret slipped into the jeep again, her heartbeat slow and steady. The early morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of acacia blossoms and dust. As they approached the rise where the previous day's miracle had occurred, James slowed the vehicle. "If they're here," he murmured, "they'll be just beyond this ridge." Margaret steadied herself against the side of the jeep. She wasn't expecting another reunion. She wasn't foolish enough to hope for more than what she'd been given. Yesterday had been a gift, one final moment of love, forgiveness, and recognition. But when the jeep crested the hill, Margaret inhaled sharply. The pride was there. Lionesses sprawled across the warm rocks, 3 cubs tumbling and wrestling clumsily in the tall grass. And there, standing a little apart, as if keeping watch, was Aslan. The wind lifted his mane, turning it into a shimmering halo of gold and copper. He stood tall, proud, every inch the king of this land. And though many lions never glanced twice at vehicles, Aslan immediately turned his head toward the jeep, nostrils lifting as if tasting the air. Margaret's eyes stung. "He knows," she whispered. "I think he does," James agreed softly. But this time Aslan did not approach. He did not run to her. He did not cross the invisible line between wildness and the memory of his youth. Instead, something even more profound happened. He walked toward his cubs. One of the little ones, barely 6 months old with paws too big for its body, tried to pounce on him. Aslan responded with a low, playful rumble, nudging the cub gently with his nose, before lifting a massive paw and pinning it to the ground in mock reprimand. The cub wriggled, growling in indignation. Margaret laughed softly, pressing her hand to her heart. He was a good father, gentle, patient, present. Everything she had sacrificed had led to this. James glanced at her. "Do you want me to drive closer?" She shook her head. "No. He's exactly where he should be." As if hearing her, Aslan straightened and turned his head toward her. Their eyes met for a brief, powerful moment. In that simple exchange, a silent conversation spanning a dozen years, Margaret understood the truth. He remembered her yesterday because he needed to. Today he remembered her, but chose his life. And that was the greatest gift of all. She raised her hand in a small gesture of farewell. Aslan blinked slowly, a lion's version of a softened expression, then nudged his cub toward the pride. He didn't bow this time. He didn't step forward. He didn't break the bond with his family. This was the wild. This was balance. This was love matured into something deeper: respect, gratitude, peace. "Goodbye, my boy," Margaret murmured. "Be happy." Aslan's mane caught the rising sun, turning him into a glowing silhouette against the savanna. He lifted his head and released a single steady roar. Not aggressive, not territorial. A farewell, a thank you, a promise fulfilled. Margaret felt tears spill freely, but she smiled. She understood. Their reunion had changed everything, not because he returned to her, but because he showed the world that memory, loyalty, and love were not human inventions. They were universal truths written into the hearts of all living beings. Aslan turned, joined his pride, and disappeared into the tall grass. Margaret whispered, "Go on, King. The world is yours now." And for the first time in years, she felt completely whole. In the quiet that followed Aslan's final disappearance into the grass, Margaret remained seated in the jeep, hands trembling lightly in her lap, heart steady in a way it hadn't been in years. What she had witnessed over the past 2 days wasn't simply a reunion. It wasn't just a miracle of recognition or an anomaly of animal behavior. It was something deeper, something that challenged every rigid rule humans have tried to place on nature, memory, and love. Because what happened between her and Aslan defied science, but aligned perfectly with the truth that lives in the deepest places of the human heart. His return to her, that tender moment when a fully grown lion laid his massive head in her lap, was not about imprinting or instinct. It was about connection, real, conscious connection. The kind of bond that asks for nothing, expects nothing, but lives on anyway. It was the echo of a promise made on a sun-scorched afternoon, 12 years earlier, when a dying mother placed her cub into the hands of a woman she somehow trusted. It was the living proof that love, even when given only once, even when expressed in the quietest of moments, can leave marks so permanent that not even time or wilderness can erase them. But the farewell she witnessed the next morning was just as meaningful, maybe even more so. Aslan, seeing her, recognizing her, yet choosing to stay with his pride, was a reminder that love isn't possession. True love doesn't pull someone back from their destiny. It gives them the strength to walk toward it. Margaret didn't raise Aslan to keep him. She raised him to free him. And because of that, he had become everything he was meant to be: a leader, a protector, a father, a king. And he still remembered her. That small truth, simple and quiet, held the weight of a lifetime. From this story, we learn something we rarely say out loud: that acts of kindness do not disappear into the void. That the love we give, whether to people, to animals, or to the world, continues its journey long after it leaves our hands. That compassion creates ripples we may never fully see, but which still shape lives in ways we can't imagine. Margaret didn't just save a lion. She saved a bloodline. She saved a future. She honored a dying mother's final plea. She carried the responsibility of that moment with courage and humility. And Aslan in return carried her memory across a continent, across a lifetime, across the boundary between wild instinct and conscious choice. Their story teaches us that the bonds formed through love are not limited by biology, species, or time. They're written in something far older than language, in something the human heart has always understood, but sometimes forgets to trust. Courage comes in many forms. Sometimes it's running toward danger. Sometimes it's caring for something fragile. And sometimes it's letting go. Margaret did all three and was rewarded with a miracle that will be remembered for generations. As you close this story, take with you the reminder that what you do matters. The kindness you offer may outlive you. The promises you keep may echo farther than you ever intended. And the love you show even once can leave a mark on the world strong enough to be felt long after you're gone. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the beauty that still exists in compassion, courage, and connection, I invite you to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you more true emotional and inspiring stories that reveal the heart behind the wild and the extraordinary moments that make us believe again. Subscribe, stay with us, and let the next story touch your heart just as deeply as this one.